First of all, welcome everyone to the December Greater Hilltop Area Commission Economic Development Committee meeting. Discussions are greatly enhanced by the presence of others who actually join us. So a special thank you to all of you who come to join us this evening. And a real special thank you to Mr. Cleve Ricksecker for being willing to be with us tonight and for being our presenter. To assist everyone's ability to participate, we ask that you please use the raise hand feature that is part of the chat. If you click on, actually it's part of participants. If you click on participants, the participants will appear to the right side of your screen when screen share isn't on. And it allows you to raise your hand. That way Dick Fagan or Dan Fagan, I'm sorry, and myself will watch for you. And then that way we'll have organization as far as so people all get a chance to talk. We ask that you kind of limit your comments and questions so we can actually move more quickly through conversation and involve more people. We also ask that we keep our discussion tonight positive and constructive. We are not necessarily here to just talk about what is, but we really want to talk about what really can be a real vision for our part of the West Side, and really what we need to be doing and what we need to be thinking about for our area to actually become self-actualized and reach its full potential. It's time perhaps that we trade in old thinking and the mediocre for a new vision, new attitude, and a new way of looking at things to bring those hopes and dreams really about or actually into reality. Our presenter this evening, Cleve Ricksecker, almost doesn't need me to introduce him, but we will introduce him anyway for those of you who may not be as familiar with him. He was the former president of the SID Public Services Association that operates 2 special improvement districts in downtown Columbus. He was there from 1999 to the current year when he retired. They collect fees from taxes and they use that money to pay for the management of their public areas, the capital improvements downtown, that transit pass program, landscaping, and other promotional services. The safety program they run has had national acclaim from Homeland Security, as well as by the Ohio Community Policing Association. And their great downtown C-Pass was recognized as the best transportation policy decision in 2017. Cleve also has served as the executive director of Riverfront Commons Corporation, where he managed the process of creating a plan for developing the Scioto and Olentangy riverfronts through downtown. And he also served as executive director of the Short North Business Association. He's a licensed attorney and an urban dweller who has lived 59 of his 67 years proudly without owning a motor vehicle. He also sent his children to Columbus City schools and lives with his wife, Lisa Fry, in the Short North. And in his retirement, he continues to look for even more opportunities to become involved in the Columbus community. And this is where we should cue that old disco song from the Village People, Go West. Maybe we could entice him to come here someday. But anyway, without any further ado, Cleve, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks. So yeah, I've lived in the Short North since 1980. So as you can imagine, I've seen a lot of changes since then. And in the early to mid 1990s, I was the first executive director of the Short North Business Association. I think I'm being asked to do some comments tonight for a couple of reasons. One is I'm a big fan of Hilltop. I will oftentimes just drive through neighborhoods in the Hilltop and just marvel at how wonderful this neighborhood is. I'm a big fan of it. But I'm not an expert on Hilltop. I'm not an expert on development. What I'll do now is to just give some observations, and my observations might be no more than 15 or 20 minutes. And to the extent that I can start a conversation tonight about Hilltop, that would probably be a good goal. There are, interestingly enough, many similarities between the Hilltop and Short North. For example, the Short North is actually made up of 7 distinct neighborhoods. between downtown and Ohio State University. They include Italian Village on the east side of High Street, Victorian Village around Goodale Park on the west side of High Street, Harrison West, Denison Place, just below Denison Place, just above Denison Place is a little neighborhood called Necco. And then above Fifth Avenue on the east side of High Street is Wineland Park. And so in that sense, the Short North is very similar to Hilltop in that it's a large area that is broken into a number of smaller neighborhoods. And in each of those neighborhoods were a group of activists who really sort of drove efforts to redevelop the areas and encourage investment in those areas. And really not, until recently, not a lot of coordination among those various different neighborhoods. It's the other thing that's interesting about the Short North is that, like Hilltop, there are two commercial streets. High Street, of course, everyone is aware of that, and then 4th Street has become quite a strong commercial street as well. It's really hard to describe what the Short North looked like 40 years ago when I moved here. I'm going to show you some pictures so you can appreciate it, and you can appreciate that in many ways the Short North 40 years ago was in worse condition than the Hilltop is now. It's grown in 40 years from a desperately poor crime neighborhood to one that we see today. But once it's important to know that I'm not talking about a 40-year span of time here. Once the Short North began attracting a core group of people, activists, entrepreneurs, developers, it really took only about 5 years to establish a trend that we've been seeing continue beyond that initial 5 years from 1980 to 1985. And I say that because given the right set of circumstances, Hilltop could begin to see a trend develop in as short as 5 years. It doesn't take 40 years to change a neighborhood. So I'm going to start off by showing some pictures of High Street now and what they looked like in 1980. So you can all appreciate that the Short North wasn't always the way it is now. It didn't necessarily need to become what it is today. It became what it is today because of a lot of active people, activists, entrepreneurs, and developers who are in the neighborhood. And so I'm going to walk you through several intersections and locations. This intersection is the corner of Russell and North High Street. Victorian Gates on the left. On the right is a building that includes Marcella's restaurant. The Pearl is located in that building. Back in 1980, when I moved to the neighborhood, this is what it looked like. It was abandoned. The only building that was occupied is in the far corner of High Street and Russell. There was a men's shelter on the first floor of that building. This building is at 3rd and High. It includes the Valencia, which is the apartment building, which was completed about 2 years ago. And then there's a health center that's located beyond that, boarded up temporarily because of some fears about demonstrations that might have broken out in the Short North. Back in 1980, it was an auto repair shop and a business equipment store. This shows Marcella's. It shows Anthropology, a new office building called the Joseph, as it looks today. Back in 1980, it looked like this, vacant building and a vacant lot. This shows the Body Shop, which is the building that you can see at the intersection, a deep building with the storefronts cut in the side. The reason why it's called the Body Shop is that back prior to 1980, it was a body shop for Chevrolet. This building is called Carriage Place. It formerly held Rigsby's restaurant, more recently Harvey and Ed's. You can see Jenny's Ice Cream in the beyond Rigsby's. Back in 1980, it was a completely abandoned stretch of High Street, with the exception of the Old Time Religion Hall, which I went to one time and watched a faith healer encourage somebody to blow a cancer out of his nose. So big changes over the years, but it's really important to emphasize that this has been an evolution, and it's been driven by a few people. Very start in the early 1980s, and then as momentum started to build up, more and more people got involved. But again, I want to emphasize the trajectory of the Short North was really established in a 5-year period of time. Excuse me, between 1980 and 1985. After 1985, it was apparent to everyone that development would continue, because at that point there was a certain confidence that people had gained, that the neighborhood would improve over time, much like we're seeing in Franklinton today. But even though in Franklinton there's still deep poverty and quite a bit of derelict buildings, nevertheless, people feel a sense of optimism, and they're willing to make investments because of that optimism, not necessarily because of what Franklinton looks like today. So like the Short North, the Hilltop has many of the same features. It is surrounded by big employment centers. So in any direction from Hilltop, you can find a major employment center. That's very important for establishing a neighborhood and encouraging investment and new residents to move in. Like the Short North, the Hilltop has a very rich built environment, and it gives an affordable option for young people to invest and renovate one house at a time and one storefront at a time. Franklinton is already becoming expensive. The potential residential pioneers, artists, urbanists, young people, they'll begin to gravitate to Hilltop as prices go up, and as they have already gone up in Franklinton. There's a rapidly growing demand for urban living in Columbus. There's much more demand for Hilltop-style neighborhoods now than there was in 1980. In 1980, people they'd never seen one in Columbus, and so there's no example for people to draw from. But now we've got the Short North, we've got Old Town East, Franklinton is well on its way. People really understand what these neighborhoods are all about, the value of having a walkable neighborhood and a mixed-use neighborhood. And so the demand is much than it was in 1980. But, and this is a big but, there's a limited supply of those neighborhoods. The supply is fixed. There are no new Hilltops being built. Think about that. So no new Hilltops being built, limited and fixed supply. But at the same time, there's a prediction that we'll get 1 million new residents in Columbus between now and 2050. So 1 million new residents in Central Ohio, and a limited supply of pre-1955 walkable mixed-use neighborhoods with good public transportation, good parks, and quality housing. Limited supply, big demand. If Hilltop could capture just 1% of that 1 million people over the next 30 years, that's 10,000 people that would move into Hilltop. So I am very confident that over the next 1 or 2 decades, we're going to see a vast transformation in Hilltop as a lot of investment comes in. The question is, and I think one of the things that you're interested in talking about tonight is there anything Hilltop leaders can do to facilitate growth in the neighborhood? And as I mentioned, I'm no expert on this, but I'll give my observations, and to the extent they generate some conversation, that'd be great. Observation number 1 is that it's really important to maintain residential stability where it exists currently. Secondly, it's important to encourage local entrepreneurial growth on Broad Street and Sullivan Avenue. It's important to get 1 or more commercial property owners on Broad Street or Sullivan Avenue to rehabilitate property and lease it to local entrepreneurs. And then finally, it's important to secure a champion in City Council. So repeat those 4 observations: maintain residential stability, encourage local entrepreneurial growth, get one or more commercial property owners on Broad or Sullivan to rehab property, and secure a champion in city council. I'll start with observation number 1. I went through census information today prior to this presentation just to see what the household values, median household values, and incomes were in Hilltop. And it was very interesting because I looked at the census information and having driven through many neighborhoods, I've seen with my own eyes what I read about today. And that is the Hilltop has 3 solid middle-class neighborhoods right now. Westgate is one, Miriam, which I've never heard that name before, but I saw it on a map that Jeff sent over to me. And then Wilshire Heights. Those 3 neighborhoods have poverty levels that are very low and are not considered to be neighborhoods that are at risk of poverty, at least now at all. And as long as those neighborhoods remain strong, there's an opportunity for growth, because a strong neighborhood like, say, Wilshire Heights or Westgate, it'll bleed into the adjoining areas over time. The other census tracts that I looked at in Hilltop are experiencing increases in poverty. It was very interesting. Every other census tract. So north of Broad, the census tract runs from the state Department of Transportation on the east all the way to the west side of Hilltop. In 1980, that census tract had a poverty rate of 8.2%. By 2010, the poverty rate was up to 27.9%. And in 2018, the poverty rate's at 37%. The top of the hill, south of Broad, east of Whitethorn Avenue. So the very eastern part of the Hilltop, south of Broad, in 1980, 15.3% of the population was in poverty. By 2010, that number is 24.4%. 2018 is 45.7% poverty. Between Hague and Whitethorn, there are 2 census tracts. They've gone from the teens up to the 40 percentile in terms of poverty. And likewise, 2 census tracts south of Sullivan and east of Wilshire Heights. 1980, the poverty rate was in the teens, and currently it's in the 40s for both of those neighborhoods. I don't give this information to depress everybody, but because even in those neighborhoods, and as I've driven through, I've seen there are pockets of investment and stability. I'm always impressed that in every area of Hilltop, I drive through neighborhoods where there's a great amount of care and pride on blocks, even in neighborhoods that are going through continue to go through divestment. But it's important to recognize Hilltop is not one monolithic neighborhood. It's huge. Hilltop is a city in its own right. It's a collection of many neighborhoods. Each is in its own stage of either investment or divestment at this point, and the neighborhoods will not develop evenly. There'll be an uneven development of these neighborhoods. It's very important to maintain all areas of middle-class stability in Hilltop. As I said, if they do well, they will bleed into adjoining areas. And so, one observation is protect those areas that are still stable middle-class neighborhoods. Observation 2, Broad Street and Sullivan Avenue, they need entrepreneurs. Creative entrepreneurs really give a signal to everyone passing through Hilltop that things are happening there. And I've seen some of it. Just this week, I did shopping at Coco on North Westmore. And what I've seen at the corner of Broad and North Westmore is pretty remarkable in terms of Coco, the Third Way Cafe. And I think I saw an artist co-op that was located on that half block as well. This kind of small scale investment is a big, big, big first step. It really, you get a few creative people who are doing really wonderful things like at this intersection. They will draw other creative people, and that whole tendency toward young creative people coming in will start to grow over time. And these businesses need neighborhood support. So I hope everyone in Hilltop is supporting these kinds of new businesses that come in. Observation 3, as you get some small scale commercial nodes established, one or more property owners will need to step up to the plate and take some risks and renovate buildings. That's what happened in the short north. 5 years after some creative businesses opened in 1980, we started seeing development take place, first from some property owners in the area, Stelios Giannopoulos, Peter Avradopoulos, Lieta Mentitis, a lot of Greek families owned properties in the area, and they saw some entrepreneurial activity in the neighborhood, and they made a leap. They took a risk and started rehabbing some buildings. And then we got Sandy Wood companies that came in, who was an actual developer, a small scale developer. And he started working on properties. The Body Shop was one of Sandy Wood's properties. And all these people really understood the possibilities for the neighborhood and set a high standard both in design and urbanity. And they were very careful to set a positive tone in how they developed their property, and were careful as well to develop property in close proximity so that they could begin to cluster small scale retailers and offer affordable retail space. As you know, space in the short north is no longer affordable. And where are those galleries and those startup businesses going to go now that they can no longer afford space in the short north? And to people in the short north who say, oh, you know, it's a terrible thing that's happening in the short north, we're getting chains and the space is becoming too expensive for, you know, interesting startup businesses, I say, well, move to the Hilltop, because there's plenty of great space on Broad Street in the Hilltop. And some neighborhoods got to start receiving these startup businesses now that the short north is no longer affordable. So I wonder, are there property owners on Broad Street or Sullivan who might take the leap and begin to do some development? And then my final observation is that it always helps to have a champion in City Hall, willing to enable things to happen. The Short North had that with Pete Cass and with Council Member Maury Portman, who really got the ball rolling with some very modest incentive programs in the Short North. But over the years, they put money into streetscape enhancements and did enable things to happen. And so I don't know if this babbling on my part strikes a chord with anyone, but all I can say is that Hilltop is you know, one of the richest, environmentally one of the richest places in the city of Columbus, and I think it's inevitable that changes are going to come to that neighborhood. The only question is, will there be some catalysts in that area that can help speed that process up, or will it be a slower process that'll still happen? Limited supply of that kind of Hilltop style neighborhood, 1 million people moving into Columbus, it's going to happen.
Okay, now we can move to the discussion part of this evening. I will start off. You mentioned the word catalyst, Cleve. Could catalyst also be the same thing as, because you need some strong residential areas, especially the areas where people now can buy in and they can buy cheap and they can fix up houses like many of us did in the short north. And that also helps bring about business. But in order to do all that, you do need some form of organization like we had in the short north with all those area commissions they created for us. Catalysts in the form of civic associations, various named civic areas like we have now. I mean, some consider that an obstacle. I really never have, because I'm from the east side originally. We had subdivisions within our sections of town, and same thing when I lived in the short north. If you could maybe address that, the value of civics, since we just have one large area commission and it covers everything down to the freeway.
Well, you know, if you look at Hilltop as a whole, the idea of redeveloping Hilltop is overwhelming. It's such a huge area. And so the value, like the short north, it would be overwhelming in 1980 for somebody to say, oh, how do we approach the short north is that the Denison Place Association was probably one of the earlier active civic associations. And there's a lot of residential development between Fifth Avenue and King Avenue early on, which spilled over onto High Street because most of the commercial development in the early 1980s happened near Fifth and High, believe it or not. And the betting people at the time were saying that the north end of the Short North would develop quicker than the south end of the Short North. But then people in Victorian Village organized and they started moving things and activating things further south. And Italian Village is very late in the process to develop. And as time had gone by, it's actually the most beautifully renovated area of the Short North now, much more so than the west side of High Street and Victorian Village. My point is that people relate much more to their immediate surroundings and are much more able to take responsibility for their more immediate surroundings. And so having a number of civic organizations focused on their own neighborhoods is probably a good thing, because if anyone tries to focus on Hilltop as a whole, as I said before, it'll be overwhelming. It's just such a huge area.
We have a question. The first one to raise their hand was Jenny, and then next after her will be Betty. Jenny, did I unmute you?
I just did.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ricksecker, for being here. You're so awesome. The Short North is, for about 20 years, is about my second home. From the beginning of the gallery hops to working off and on for about 15 years for Axis and Union and Havana.
Yeah.
So my question is, if you could go back in time and do anything differently about the approach towards developing the Short North, what would you change? Like, have there been disappointments for you in kind of revamping or encouraging development in the Short North?
Yeah, there is actually, and it's an editorial I should say, and that is the mistake. One of the mistakes the Short North made, really the city made, was not to lock in more affordable housing when it was still affordable to do that. And so, and I personally did, as part of the Short North Business Association, sort of ram through an affordable housing project at Star and High years ago. It's now being converted back to market rate housing, unfortunately. But there are very few efforts made in the early 1980s to lock in affordable housing. And that's always important to do, because as a neighborhood gentrifies and people move into a neighborhood, they don't object to things that are already there. We've got halfway houses, we've got group homes, we've got Section 8 housing. And because it preceded the investment that came into the neighborhood, people are fine with it. It's only when you bring something in after, middle and upper middle class people have moved in that issues arise. And so that's the one thing that would have been, I think, helpful, is if I suppose the city could have fashioned some rules back in the early 80s that required a certain amount of affordable housing.
Thank you so much.
Betty?
Well, thank you, Cleve, and congratulations on your retirement. I highly recommend it when we're not in COVID. I do have a question for you, and the affordable housing thing is really interesting and a passion for mine, because the housing incentive policy actually has. I'm
sorry, would you repeat your question? All of a sudden I got muted and I had to unmute again.
Okay, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. The affordable housing thoughts that you have are interesting, because we actually, the Hilltop is in the ready for revitalization. So any developer who's taking incentives, they do have to set aside affordable housing. And so I do applaud the city council for doing that. I think they could have gone a little bit farther. But so I'm hopeful for that. But my one question is about the perception of Flytown. And I'm older than you are, so I'm old enough to remember when it was called Flytown, and every bit as bad as some of our areas in terms of the trash and the drugs and the prostitutes. What did you do? And we're kind of like the Hilltop as a name, but what would you recommend that we do to kind of change the perception? I mean, you changed the name from Flytown, and it seemed a little easier to change the name. If we don't want to do that, how do we go about changing the perception?
Well, Flytown, interesting enough, was an entire neighborhood cleared through some slum clearance back in the early 60s. It became Thurber Village. And unfortunately, that's unfortunate because if you look at pictures of Flytown, it looks a whole lot like German Village, small scale, more frame than brick houses. But to answer your question, yeah, I mean, prostitution in particular was a big problem in the Short North in the 1980s. Literally on street corners like Star and High, there would be as many as a dozen prostitutes, and they'd queue up for their johns. Park Street was where all the male johns worked. There were, conceivably, 100 prostitutes every night would work in the Short North. How is it? There is more enforcement now than there was back then. Johns are now targeted as well as prostitutes. And so things got a little better once in the late 1980s when the penalties for either hiring or being a prostitute were increased. But I think, the problems like that occur when space is vacant, when no one's really taking responsibility for a storefront. And so to the extent that houses are occupied and commercial buildings on Broad Street and Sullivan Avenue are occupied with reputable businesses run by reputable people, they will take responsibility for what's happening on their own stoops. There are limits to how much law enforcement can accomplish. I suppose that there are better ways of policing, maybe combining social workers with police so that there are a number of remedies that are available when there are issues like prostitution. But ultimately, individuals have to claim their space, and that requires buildings to be occupied and active, it seems to me.
Thank you.
And by the way, these I don't know. I mean, you may disagree with that. This is a conversation. I don't know that anybody really knows the answer to that question.
Cleve, I think the other thing she wanted to know was the perception, because I remember we never used that word SN or Short North at all for many years, and then it became vogue again. What really changed the perception of that word Short North? Was it Short North itself, by itself, or was it basically the very individual neighborhoods that created a patchwork, like a quilt, a patchwork of different interesting areas? Was that what did it? You lived there longer than I did.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what did it was the appearance of High Street. And as long as High Street looked shabby and looked dangerous, people perceived the entire neighborhood was dangerous. And so a couple of things come to mind. When the neighborhood began promoting the arts, there was a time in the mid 1980s when the coverage of the arts superseded coverage of prostitution and drug dealing in the area. And so it was a combination of High Street looking better and then the neighborhood promoting an identity that became stronger than the negative identity that existed in the late 70s and very early 1980s. But those main commercial corridors are what people see when they drive through the neighborhood. And as long as Broad Street and Sullivan Avenue don't look vibrant and don't look healthy, or at least don't have blocks that look healthy and vibrant. It doesn't take much. 2 or 3 good blocks on Sullivan Avenue and 2 or 3 good blocks on Broad Street would do wonders for the image of Hilltop. I think of Detroit Avenue in Cleveland, which was, the west side of Cleveland. Detroit Avenue just looked like hell. And it gave the impression that the neighborhoods, Ohio City, Gordon Square, around Detroit were equally bad. But Gordon Square is an area of Detroit Avenue, maybe 8 blocks, that the city put some effort into it, some capital improvements. There were buildings renovated, some businesses moved in, and it just that 6 or 8 block stretch of Detroit Avenue changed the perception of really pretty much the entire west side of Cleveland. I see that happening on Lorraine Avenue now. Lorraine, which was just riddled with prostitutes 20 years ago and had vacant buildings for miles, now has a stretch of maybe 4 blocks that are quite attractive and vibrant. And I would wager that if property owners on Broad Street, doesn't matter where, if it's in the Westgate area or the top of the hill, but if 2 or 3 blocks could be improved with pedestrian activity and storefronts facing the sidewalk and interesting entrepreneurial retail businesses, with a local emphasis, that the perception of Hilltop would change drastically.
Okay. Next hand raiser is one of our new commissioners, Victoria Klein. Go ahead.
Thank you. I was wondering if you thought some kind of like available property inventory might be useful for potential investors so that they could see what commercial space is available here.
Oh, good question. It sounds like a lot of work, and my guess is that part of the problem on both Sullivan and Broad Street is the fact that much of the property is held in the hands of property owners who either don't know how to improve and market their property or are greedy. And so I'm not sure an inventory would help so much as just finding that property at one property owner or 2 property owners, or even an outside developer who would just take a risk on an area of one of those 2 strips. Typically, property owners, in my experience, can be a real hindrance to redevelopment. My guess is that in the Westgate area on Broad Street, for example, that there probably would be more activity if the current property owners were a little more active and sort of living in the 21st century. I don't know the property owners on Broad Street and Westgate, but there's money out there. There should be businesses and interesting storefronts in that section of Broad Street, and closer to downtown, because people with money are commuting back and forth on Broad. It just amazes me that there hasn't been more movement on Broad Street than there is.
And next we will go to, I don't know which of the 2 raised their hand first. So let's go to Joe Argero from Highland West Civic Association.
Hi there. Are you able to hear me?
I do.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeffrey, Dan, everyone running the meeting, and Cleve for being here tonight. I have a question that's maybe like a mock interview question. You've been hired as the brand new Chief Economic Development Officer for Columbus's West Side. What is the very top agenda item for you in that new role?
Well, to respond to the earlier question, I think the first thing I would do would be to do an inventory of all the commercial property from Hague Avenue West to see who owned each of those properties. And I would then get to know all those commercial property owners and get them information on the spending power in the area and examples of what could be done with their properties in the area. Because I do think the biggest single signal that can be sent about Hilltop is a rebirth of one of those major commercial corridors. And in my mind, Broad Street west of Hague is probably, from a market standpoint, ready to go. And that would be a huge signal.
Thank you. And just
And
very
it's funny, I'll
quickly-
give you an example of
Yeah.
why that's important. Clintonville, for years, had these beautiful residential neighborhoods. High Street was looked terrible. And so if you could drive up down High Street through Clintonville and have no idea that this was, as wealthy a neighborhood as it is, because High Street itself looks so trashy with muffler shops and gas stations, and it's beginning to look better now. And that gives people the impression, people who are driving through Clintonville, of a different neighborhood than the impression they had 20 years ago.
Thank you. And to your fourth observation about make partnerships on city council, if that Lucy Frank is Lucy Frank with Mr. Remy's office, thank you for being here tonight. Appreciate it.
Of course. Thanks.
Okay, Joseph, is that it? I do want to interject one question though, Cleve, as far as, because there are a bunch of Highland West people here. What does that mean about east of Hague Avenue toward downtown? Because that area is ready to totally destroy itself or fall apart.
Yeah, it's a
a
beautiful area. I mean, that commercial strip east of Hague is such a rich area architecturally.
right.
Great building stock.
There's been very little focus on it in the past at all, because it was basically, as I've been written off. Are we to continue to do that, or is that something maybe our civic association should take on?
I'm thinking.
If you don't use it, you're going to lose it, and you're going to lose those buildings.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I'll say this: Highland West. There are beautiful blocks in Highland West, and stable blocks in Highland West. And I guess I would have to believe that there are blocks of commercial buildings on Broad Street that could reap the benefit of commuting back and forth between downtown and the west side, in terms of consumer traffic, that would also be in areas that would be stable enough that people would feel comfortable in stopping and patronizing those places. And I'm drawing a blank on some of the streets I've driven down. Richardson Avenue, I think, is one that's quite beautiful. And Jeff, your street, I think I've driven down your street as well, and quite beautiful. So no, I think it is quite possible to start development east of Hague. My only point is that in terms of walk-in traffic from the immediate neighborhood, it appears that really the West Broad Street west of Hague is probably the only place with enough consumer buying power that a walk-in trade could make things happen, much like they happened in the short north. But no, in terms of drive-in traffic and some walk-in traffic, the top of the hill is the better environment, built environment for retail.
I just thought I'd throw something in there because I want to give something to everybody so we don't overlook anyone. Okay, Josh Paxton, one of our newest commissioners. It's your turn.
Thanks. I actually have two questions. One being with the Hilltop being so large and in a way, I guess, like disconnected from downtown. I mean, other than, Broad just going straight through. How can we, I guess, like spark that redevelopment or that inspiring feel into these property owners when I guess like Franklinton is, kind of like the the in thing right now. I mean, like everybody's kind of looking at Franklinton and, you know, buying those up. How can we, I guess, like market our community, you know, to kind of get some of that, get in on that, I guess.
Well, Hilltop is very well connected to downtown on Broad Street and Sullivan and Mound. And, you know, if you look at Central Ohio as a whole, Hilltop is, you know, somebody in Powell might think Hilltop is part of downtown. I mean, it's very close to downtown, very, very well connected to downtown by bicycle, by car, by bus, by Uber. So there is a strong connection there. But I think a neighborhood like, say Highland West, a little buzz would go a long way. It's hard to market an area like Highland West or any neighborhood for that matter, but a little buzz goes a long way. If you can get some people who are savvy and who do some creative things with their housing, maybe cluster some people together in certain blocks. But I think buzz is the key here. And boy, good buzz can change things really quickly. Franklinton, it's interesting in Franklinton because Franklinton is unlike the Short North or German Village or Old Town East, in that from the get-go, once that flood wall was built, some pretty big developers have come in quickly to build some significant projects in that area. I think that's the exception. Most neighborhoods, the Short North being one, went through 25 years of development, literally one house at a time, one storefront at a time, before any developers came in and started doing any real significant work in the area. And I think that's probably the route for Hilltop, is that to the extent you can get, the housing's cheap. I mean, that means a lot. If you're one of the many millennials who want to own a house, for example, and Columbus has a ton of them, and a growing number of them, Hilltop is the neighborhood right now in terms of affordability. And, you know, a lot of people are realizing that if they want to buy a house in Franklinton, if you don't have a pretty significant income, you've already missed the boat. And so I guess that's the buzz, is that this is the new frontier, Hilltop is. And it's now for somebody, because 5 years from now, with that growth that we're experiencing in Columbus, it may be too expensive.
And then, so having such a large community, and having dealt with a lot of public meetings, it's like, how do we create a plan or a vision to grow a consensus among everybody, without having like too many arguing opinions, where I guess, like, is there a way to even, you know, think about that, or is it?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think it's very difficult to develop a consensus. I think it's more effective and easier just to do it. And by that, I mean, if there's a group of artists in the area who want to do something, just do it. In the Short North, there was no consensus that Doodah Parade would be held every year. There was no consensus that Doug Ritchie, who had a coin shop at Lincoln and High, who was the emperor of the Short North, would go out and occupy the Upper Arlington City Hall because Arlington had a Doodah division one year. There was no consensus that the Gallery Hop, I mean, the Gallery Hop was, you know, 2 people created that. They just did it. They didn't wait for somebody to give them permission or to arrive at a consensus. In fact, the whole arts district idea was not achieved by consensus. It was a very small group of people that just did it. And some things are successful, some things don't succeed. But, you know, you got to just throw some shit against the wall and see what sticks sometimes. And I'll bet that there are just so many creative people in Hilltop that if they were empowered to start doing things like, what was that, the art show in Franklinton? Shoot, I'm drawing a blank. What's that?
Scrawl?
Yes,
Scrawl?
yes, things like Scroll. I mean, they didn't ask permission to do that. They just did it. That sort of creative behavior attracts more people, and you get more creative activity going. It'll draw more people. And so I think the most important thing that anyone can do is enable as many people to do as many creative things as possible and not try to coordinate.
Right. And I think in the same way, Cleve, I mean, consensus did not create Victorian Village. It's totally non-historical in context. I mean, in context, it isn't. They have those same houses there. There was no consensus over Italian Village or any of the other things. The people that got together created, and they made something special out about each of those areas. Sometimes over here, though, there's a tendency where, like, you know how I mentioned, well, what about Highland West? That always comes up, and I've lived there over 16 years now, so I'm one of the regulars, and yeah, it always comes up. And I think sometimes maybe we want to control what other neighborhoods are doing because we either used to live there or we just don't like it and we think they should do something else. Do you see any empowerment as people create and identify even new areas for civic associations where that could be something that's really empowering to create a fabric of some totally different, really unique, special areas that would also enhance the development as well as the interest in the area?
I'm not sure you can impose
about this. I mean, you know,
you can't necessarily impose civic association in an area unless people there really want to have it. You know, they really want to get engaged in something, and there's nothing better than a crisis or a controversy to get something started.
Right.
In terms of a civic association. So I don't know if you can impose something like that, but I will. I thought about something about Highland West, which is the closest to downtown area with the richest, probably the richest built environment in the neighborhood. Like Highland West in the short north, the southern part of the short north closest to downtown was the last area really to redevelop. And so, but when it did, it really took off. And you know, who knows what will happen with Highland West once there's a little change in attitude and perception and belief in the area, that could take off very fast.
Next, I believe we have Scott Stockman, or Dan, or do you have his question for him?
Yeah, he may not be on at the moment, but he asked me if I could ask a question. Cleve, what employers were in the short north in the mid 80s, and if that was even important to what happened?
Well, that's a good point. We had Doctors Hospital, which employed probably, I don't know, 800 people. United Commercial Travelers, which is a very small insurance company on Goodale Park, on Park Street. But then close by, we had Nationwide Insurance. And then at the other end of the short north, we have Battelle. And, you know, Battelle was a problem for a while because their idea of neighborhood improvement was to, you know, tear down much of the area on Fifth Avenue and build a strip shopping center. And Nationwide was building their skywalks downtown, and you know that they weren't necessarily interacting a lot with the neighborhood, but having those big employers did benefit the neighborhood quite a bit. So that was something that the short north had. I don't know that there are any. Well, you have the state offices at the top of the hill. I mean, that's a major employer. And you got the casino in the west, and I'm sure there are other large employers on the west side as well. And if you look at driving using a personal vehicle, there's a lot of employment in the outer belt. So you have both downtown on one side and then the outer belt on the other side, as well as the major employers in the Hilltop. I mean, I think there is enough employment really to spark a run on housing in Hilltop. I would think.
Okay. Dan, did you have a question as well?
And I do have my own question, please. So I don't know if this does exist. Cleve, is there like a graphical representation of how the Short North kind of developed? You know, I remember, I'm an older guy. I remember back in the 80s and 90s, you know, there was a time where it's like, whew, I'm not going to go above this street, you know, today. You know, not now that it's dark, you know, but so it was interesting to see how the neighborhood continued to develop, you know, all the way even up to Fifth and further. But is there any kind of graphical depiction that exists that kind of talks about how High Street was developed and how all that kind of came together? And then I do have a two-part question. When we talk about Highland West and some of the Envision Hilltop work that was done, they will talk about the market studies, right? That they're might not support certain kinds of businesses being developed, right? So did the Short North experience that when you talked about those early entrepreneurs, those early developers that did they, you know, were they looking for financing? Were they struggling with what the market presented? Do you know about that? Can you speak about that?
Yeah, I can. There was no market study early on.
No.
There was no neighborhood-wide effort to identify retailers, but what did happen is this. The wood companies and Peter Avradopoulos and I think Stelios Giannopoulos, when they renovated their buildings on a 2-block stretch of High Street, they created small affordable space and they white boxed the space so that if you were a startup retailer with an idea and didn't have the wherewithal to, you know, build out a space, you could move in, paint the walls, set up your shelves, and start selling. And then the Sandy Wood and Stelios in particular, and Peter Avradopoulos as well, they were at least a little conscious of not leasing to the first potential tenant that came along, and tried to use the space they had collected that was proximate to create a mix. Sandy was very good about including you know, art galleries in his projects. And so his first building was the Carriage Place. And in that one building he leased to Rigsby's, Putting on the Dog, which is a vintage clothing store, Spangler Cummings Gallery. Spangler, 1985, coined the phrase gallery hop. Did I say Rigsby's already? Anyways, a mix of retail and the same. Russian Tea Room was there. And likewise, the other owners were careful to try and mix up their tenants. It was kind of necessary to do because the space was kind of tiny. And the tiny space was really, really helpful because not only was the rent cheap per square foot, but the space was small. So it's like the cost of leasing space was nothing in Short North. And that was very helpful in attracting tenants, both the rent, the white boxing of space, and the fact you had at least a couple of landowners who were making an effort to attract interesting tenants. But no, there's never any neighborhood-wide plan. What's interesting about, there's no graphic showing how the Short North developed over the years, but what was interesting is that it changed course over the course of the first 1980 to 1990, and that the early part of the commercial strip that started developing was at 5th and High. We had 2 department stores, Acker's Hardware. There was a really beautiful series of small storefronts owned by the Malou family. It had a business like Biashara and other interesting businesses. And then the crack hit the streets in the late 1980s. And there was an entire half block was torched by somebody who was either dealing crack or on crack, I can't remember now. And so all of a sudden the development shifted in the early 1980s to the south side of the district when Sandy Wood started and Stelios started developing down there. And it took years for the north end to recover. So it was very unpredictable. And some of the conventional wisdom at the time, well, there was no conventional wisdom at the Short North. I mean, everyone had written off that neighborhood. The city, the corporate people, nobody had, there was no conventional wisdom in going into the short north and rehabbing buildings and investing in that neighborhood. But even within the neighborhood, the conventional wisdom changed from year to year. Italian Village was a mess in the south side of the short north, down near Russell and Lincoln. I mean, it was, and you're right. I mean, if you walk north on High Street, you got north of, maybe Hubbard, and it got a little iffy. You had to watch your wallet to make sure nobody took it. But the residential area east of High Street was a mess in the early 80s. And that changed radically. And as does Highland West might as well.
Okay, next I have Joe. And now I think we're at the point where people can just chime in and we can start doing that. I think it should work with the amount we have left in the group. But first though, Joe, you have a question.
Yes, thank you. I thought of another one I'd like to ask, so I appreciate your recognizing me. Thinking about city policy, be it transportation, development, building and zoning, tax, you name it. What is one policy that you might enact, change, or lobby to remove that you think we could leverage?
Well, I think for the city neighborhoods, the work that Council President Hardin is doing right now with his transportation policy, his transportation work, has a lot of potential because, for example, it looks at creating some sort of high capacity transit between Hilltop and downtown, I think along Broad Street, if I recall correctly. And that's important because a lot of younger people don't necessarily want to drive to work or drive to the clubs or, even own a car in many cases. And we're seeing in some of the in-town neighborhoods like Old Town East, for example, which has one of the highest rapidly growing millennial populations in the state of Ohio. And actually, interestingly enough, there are, I'm trying to think how many, 8 zip codes in Ohio that have the fastest growing millennial populations. 3 of them are in Columbus. All the ones that are outside of Columbus are suburban zip codes. The ones in Columbus are downtown, Old Town East, and there's a third one, maybe King Lincoln. But what's interesting about that is there's a relationship between working downtown, in-town lifestyles, public transportation, bicycles, and a lot of people who are younger want lifestyle options. And what Hilltop can offer that Arlington can't or Powell can't, with really good public transportation, is the option of a car-free lifestyle and an urban lifestyle that appeals to a lot of people. And to the extent that there's rapid, high-capacity transit from Hilltop downtown closes that gap between those two areas. To Josh's point earlier about proximity to downtown, because that relationship between Hilltop and downtown is a really important one for a certain type of person, and anything that strengthens that relationship, I'm going to wager will help that neighborhood.
Thank you.
Okay, as we enter our discussion, Cleve, can you hit the share screen button again? Unless you have more to share, that'll open up our squares so we can actually see each other when we talk. It's easier if we'll do kind of a talk back and forth among ourselves. We do have to be over by or before 8:30, okay? Because, well, Cleve, you have that Cleveland Browns, is the Browns, right? Yeah.
Yes, they started, actually, the game starts at 8:15.
Oh, heavens. Okay. I'm just going to throw it in here because usually what our biggest hindrance we're always told, I mean, there was a time when we were told the sky was the limit, and it always comes up. There's a lot of crime and there's a lot of trash, but I saw the same thing in your neighborhood lately. I mean, how does one stop allowing that to get in the way of what we, because had we let that get in the way of us in the short north, I mean, I had neighbors who were taken hostage by people that sneaked in their house by breaking in through the basement window and it held them by gunpoint all night. I mean, and that was in the 1990s, so it wasn't that long ago. So I'm just, it's not like we were immune to danger, but I mean, we did not allow that to destroy our concept of what we wanted for our community. I mean, how do we get beyond that? Because otherwise we're always back to those basic subjects. I mean, you know, and I think sometimes they do get in the way of an actual vision as far as moving forward.
You know, back in 1980, people would say, oh, you moved to the short north, isn't it dangerous? And my common response, which was a true response, is, well, there's an occasional murder, but it's always among family members. And I suspect that's the same case with Hilltop, that, you know, really the amount of crime that is among unrelated people is probably pretty low in that area. The other thing that really strikes me is in terms of trash and dirt and graffiti. Some of the filthiest places I've seen are some of the most wonderful cities in the world. Milan, Florence, Amsterdam, Antwerp. I've not done a lot of travel, but you know, trash and filth and, you know, urine smells, that's an international issue. And unfortunately, you know, Americans, we're so used to living in our little cul-de-sacs where there's no litter or trash or people urinating, whatever. But it's a fact, and with an interesting enough neighborhood, people don't care about that stuff. It's like parking in the short north. People are always bitching about parking in the short north. Well, first of all, there's plenty of parking. Secondly, if there's not enough parking, take the bus. But thirdly, is that because it's so interesting, people will park and do what they have to, you know, park remotely and do what they have to do to get there. The most important thing is to have an interesting place. If you have an interesting place with interesting activities, the trash and the parking won't be an issue.
Yeah, as the spirits of the neighborhood lift up, you're saying basically the trash, you have more people. I mean, I know in my area, people started picking the stuff up eventually. And also, speaking of parking,
Yeah.
since that parking app came to be, Cleve, I never have problems finding parking over there anymore. Some of the streets are downright empty in the short north. Are they all parking in Harrison West and walking over? It's
Well, I'll tell you what, everyone that lives in the short north is walking to High Street now. And maybe 20, 25 years ago, they would have driven. And I know that prior to COVID, many people would take the bus into the short north, particularly during times when it would be crowded, weekends, for example, evenings, many evenings. And so people, if they're drawn to a place, will find a way to get there.
Okay, anyone have anything else you want to ask, add, comment?
Yeah, I have a quick question. So the Neighborhood Design Center has been focusing on like small projects along Sullivan Avenue. Like there's a Jamaican restaurant that just got a small facelift. There's a little parklet next to a bus stop, like things like that. In your experience, do you think it's better to have a series of small projects like that spread throughout a corridor, or do you think having a group of small projects like that grouped in a small area would be better?
Well, the design center is fabulous. They were located on High Street in 1980 in what's now Mary Catherine's Antiques, and played a big role in a lot of redevelopment in the short north and design work. But to answer your question, it's a bigger impact if you concentrate activity. If you concentrate, renovations on a couple of blocks, and if you spread it out over half a mile or a mile. It's not to say that the projects that are being done aren't good and valuable and wonderful, but in terms of impact, concentrating things is much better.
So chiming in on what you were talking about with splitting up into different smaller neighborhoods, I'm like the little hilltop historian chickie, and I've been seeking out like the original division advertisements for residential divisions in the hilltop. I have a group on Facebook called the Hilltop Property Archive, and it's all filed away by street names and by division names. But I love your idea. Like I just found there's one area north of Broad, west of Hague. I didn't realize it was called Columbia Park until I found the original ads in the dispatch. And I mean, it's kind of across the way from Westgate. But I like the idea of kind of creating little, like smaller collective identities based on these different neighborhoods that were created at different times around the hilltop.
And based on history, it's wonderful.
Right.
It's a great thing.
And as far as Highland West goes, that's a broad term, but Highland West is a community of all those original subdivisions. I mean, my subdivision is 2 blocks wide. It's called Bel Air. We have Oakley to the west. I have Landscape to the east, and Landscape to the east. We have Maple Grove to the east, where the Friends Quaker Church, the first church on the hill, was built, and now the Methodists have it. So we all were known by our own names, but now obviously, since all of them are only a few blocks wide, you kind of have to have a general term that includes all of them. So what we're trying to do in Highland West is, as we create block watch organizations, we just created what we call Eldon Heights. And that takes care of everything north of Broad, between Eureka and Richardson. So we're trying to bring the old names back within the context of a larger umbrella organization, so to speak. But yeah, I mean, like Wilshire Heights is great because that's a huge neighborhood in and of it. So is Miriam, you know. I mean, they already, Holly Hill, my goodness, they already have a name that covers a lot of territory. When he deals with us and Westgate, with Broadview or Broadview and all the Camp Chase Heights, it's not as practical. So yeah, we have umbrella names for everybody. But
I know the Hillcrest subdivision's pretty big.
The what?
The Hillcrest subdivision is pretty big too.
And so is Wicklow. Wicklow's huge. Yeah. It's north and south.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
I also wanted to tell you. Oh, sorry.
Hillcrest Park. That's separate.
Yes. Yeah. Very good. You're sharper than I am. You remember stuff better than I do. Well, I haven't looked at that in a minute.
I go through these plats on a regular basis. I'm a title examiner.
Cleve, I wanted to, just one small thing. So you're talking about the body shop. That building was originally owned by the Renner family. They had an auto body shop, and the Renners were Hilltoppers.
Wow.
Yes. So little fun fact.
You know, talking about historic neighborhood names, I have been telling people in Franklinton for years that they should go back to the Bottoms, because the Bottoms, like the Short North, is an historic name for that neighborhood. And what the question I always pose is, where would you rather go dancing, Franklinton or the Bottoms?
Right. And plus, Cleve, they had that beautiful, very large subdivision, which used to be mostly state fairgrounds, west of where Mount Carmel used to be, called West Park. West Park is a really cool name because Franklinton, technically their plat ends at Souter, because that's where their cemetery is. You weren't allowed to bury people in the old days in the city limits. So, you know, it kind of ended right there, just, you know, to the east of, west of Holy Family. So, I mean, that's just another article of history. But yeah, but there's a lot of potential up here. We have a lot of names, and there's a lot of, like Hiltonia, we need to bring them back online. You know, they kind of fizzled out. But yeah, and Lisa has her South Central. That is such a cool name. I mean, cool. It makes me think of LA. Betty, did you have a question? I saw your.
I just want to thank Cleve, because And we've been poking at this and working at this for quite some time, and it's easy to get discouraged. But you've really given us a lot of thought starters. When you talked about the employers, we've got Cover My Meds, which will be bringing 1,000 workers just east of us, and not all of them are going to want to live in Franklinton. We've got the new jail, we've got Big Lots, which still has 800 jobs out here. Doctors Hospital. So we do have the employers, and I can't remember who asked, how do we market it to the business owners? My question is, how do we market it to the realtors that we have truly affordable housing? We have great housing stock east of Hague that I contend is far better than what's in Westgate historically, and far better than what's in Franklinton, and it hasn't been flooded twice. So how do we get the realtors to start seeing the Hilltop as not only centrally located to a lot of large businesses and to downtown, but affordable?
One thing you might think about doing is contacting some of the realtors who worked the Short North in the early 80s. Bruce Dooley, for example, was one.
Oh yeah, Bruce.
Mary Reza was another one.
Yes.
Because they might have more more thoughts about how to approach that, whether it's a realtor tour of blocks and neighborhoods in Hilltop or something else. But there must be a way, because it's Hilltop in many ways, and Highland West in particular, it's a unique opportunity, because it's a neighborhood that has very inexpensive housing, great housing stock, proximity to downtown, proximity to other employers, and a great commercial strip. And there's a story there that people need to know about. But maybe Mary and Bruce could offer some suggestions, because they worked in a similar environment back in the early 80s.
Who was the first name? You said Bruce Dooley, which I know, and who's the other one?
Mary Raysa, Raysa.
Yeah.
And I was speaking to Jeffrey last night, and I told him that I was asked to speak at the Realtor Board, the Columbus Realtor Board, to talk about houses that were under $185,000. And at that time, Westgate was kind of pushing that limit. So I guess I need to reach back to them. We probably need to reach back to them. And I like your idea of a tour, and I will work with Jeffrey and maybe reach out to Bruce and to Marion.
And if we work with the, sorry.
Maybe it's a neighborhood house tour as well, with a clever name, like the Hilltop Tour of Inexpensive Houses, or I don't know what it would be, but it could be a public tour as well.
Or a big sign that says, "We have cheap house," or no, cheap houses. That would be the cover sheet. But no, Lisa, you have been really quiet, and the thing is, you have been a part of this community doing stuff South Central area for so long. Do you have anything you want to share with observations or anything with us?
Hi, thank you, Cleve, for coming tonight to give us a lot to think about. I'm just this presentation is just going through my head right now, and it really hasn't sank in, because I have been so focused on sidewalks, trash, crime. Are you there?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, you froze on me. I didn't know if you were still there. I've been so focused on issues, I haven't even thought about like the arts and other things like that. I'm just trying for our neighborhood to be safe and clean. I can't even think that far ahead. I can't think of us being like a Short North, because I am just so in the now right now of cleaning the place up, because it's a lot of folks have moved because of the crime and the trash. And so, thinking about arts and things like that, it has me like my head spinning right now because I'm just so focused on trash and crime and infrastructure. Just making it a safe,
Which is really important.
safe, clean place to live is all I want. I don't want anything fancy. I'm a down-to-earth person who lives a humble life, and you know, I'm not worried about, you know, a fancy neighborhood. I just want it safe and clean. And I think there are a lot of residents that just want a safe, clean neighborhood. And
Right.
so I'm just kind of mulling all of this around in my head to see how maybe I'm going at it all wrong, because I've been doing cleanups for 20 years, holding neighborhood events
No,
multiple times.
Lisa, it makes a big difference. You know, there've been studies to show that neighborhoods that are clean and orderly looking have lower crime rates. So what you're doing is actually really important work. There's no question about that. I guess the question is, can you bring in fresh blood to join you in doing things that you're maybe not able to do or don't have time to do?
Right. I mean, I like to organize events. I like bringing the community together. And for me, that's kind of the big thing, is the community coming together often to talk and to interact with our government, our businesses, our residents. I feel like we need to come together, you know, at events. Events are my big thing. I like bringing people together. I like the place to be clean. I like crime to be down. I just, that's to me is the most important thing. And so I'm just kind of, you know, I'm just,
Yeah,
it's
Lisa,
not, obviously it's not working, but I've been doing this for 20 something years, 23 years. When I started the Block Watch, it was basically to address crime. But as the years rolled on, the trash became like an issue for me, a big issue. And I started doing cleanups. I've been doing that for 20 years. And I go out and clean up trash in my neighborhood all by myself or with a group of people. It doesn't matter. Started doing more events at bringing the community together. And I think it hasn't done as well as I hoped. So here we are.
Lisa, it looks so much better down there now than it did some years ago. I'm serious, it does.
Yeah.
Parts of the hill look worse now than they did when I moved here, but I tend to look at it like a short northerner used to. We have our quarterly cleanups up here. We just did our holiday, what do we call it? Our West Broad Street holiday quickie litter pickup. We had good attendance. We had wonderful conversation with even some business owners. And also when you had yours, the same thing, Lisa, when we joined you, because now we got on Sullivan Avenue. I mean, it's really comes in really handy. We just need people to the east of both of us to assist in the effort. But those are important. We're also going to need people. And I also found that in the short north, just like in other areas I've lived in the Near East Side, when individuals that do the arts things, that do the businesses, they sometimes tend to chase folks off that are just there to cause trouble. And when those folks leave, you know, I'm not saying we do something like the Near East Side did, make it so no one can sell liquor out of any of those establishments on Main Street, but you drive down Main Street now, there is nobody hanging out and certainly no one dealing drugs. No.
I would like to see a neighborhood
Really
where we have
clean.
all incomes, I mean, where everybody can live peacefully together.
Mixed
And
development.
so that's my main goal, is everybody, and I think we can all learn from each other. Rich people can learn from poor people. There's a lot of
agree.
great morals. And so,
and that is exactly how this should happen. I mean, that's what everyone wants. So we haven't always been successful in getting the city to agree with us on that. But nevertheless, they have done what they have done, though, is united us. And there are things we can do if we have our advocate on city council. But there are things we can do on the Hill, like whether it be going to realtors and other things, they really can't control. Is that a good plan, Cleve? I mean, when you look at
Yes, and that's a very good point. It's very difficult if you're working with council or the city administration for the Hilltop to go to the city and say, do something about the crime, do something about the development. You know, they don't know your neighborhood that well. it's much easier to respond to very specific requests. So if you have a very specific request, like, there's a great gallery that wants to move into a storefront that needs some help or whatever it might be, but the more specific you can be in the ask, the better the response will be.
Yeah.
And that's, that's
Yeah.
because you're all involved, specifically what needs to happen.
Right.
And we're good at that.
Right.
Know us.
Dan,
Council
we're
knows
getting-
us, mayor's office knows us. I mean, they're
Right.
good, but they can't do everything. We
No,
right.
need all of
Right.
us to come together.
And Cleve, when I look at the short north, the city, yeah, reminded me of that big investment they made during the 80s. But a lot of these earlier town areas like Old Town and German Village, a lot of it was private money. I don't remember the city just coming in and saying, poof, and the whole new streets, I mean, not like they're doing in Wineland or out, in the Near East Side. This
Right.
would come really
Right.
quickly. We aren't going to be able to really expect that because we've always been told it's supposed to be private, which to some of us, that's what we would want it to be anyway, because then it's truly ours. It wasn't imposed on us. But yeah.
I think the city can be most helpful if the city's got credible people and credible projects to hang their hat on. And if you can deliver credible people and credible projects, then I think you can get that support you. But I don't think it's unrealistic to expect the city to figure out how to solve the problems. I think you've got to figure out specifically how to solve them, and then offer a credible way that the city can help out.
And then let them take full credit. They love that.
Yeah.
Yes,
Right.
yes, exactly. We don't care who gets the credit. We want it done. Dan, did you have something? We're going to get ready to close here.
We are getting ready to close. Leah's had her hand up for a while, and then Patrick did.
I
So
am sorry.
that's
Okay.
okay. No, I just wanted to, before Cleve left, Leah, you could go, and then Patrick.
Perfect. Thank you. Hello. My name is Leah. I'm a board member on the Highland West Civic Association. I've got, I guess, a comment more than anything. Hopefully it'll kind of wrap some things up. I want to piggyback off of what Betty and Joe and a few other people said. I guess a lot of what we've been talking about, and a lot of what happened, in German Village, in the Short North, it was private investments. It was people coming in and putting a lot of their own money into things. And what I worry about that happening over on this side is that statistically throughout the nation, the people with the money to do that are going to be white men. And we're going to, we have a really great racial diversity on this side of town. And how do we maintain that? And how do we keep the money in this neighborhood in the people's hands who need it the most? And I think a lot of that does need to come from the city. So how do we, like what Betty said, how do we sell ourselves to realtors? How do we sell ourselves to our own city? How do we make sure that they are willing to put the money where we want it to go and into, local people's hands to get this going? Because again, there's only so much that individuals are going to be able to do on their own. So that's just, one quick comment. Then I will mute myself.
That's a really good question / comment, and I do think that this may be a place where marketing, neighborhood branding could be helpful. If you market yourself as a proudly multiracial community, you can continue to attract a mix of people.
Cool. And then Patrick, you had something? I'm sorry, I didn't see your hand.
Yeah, I mean, there are two things that come to mind. One, like, how do we disincentivize the current property owners from letting their properties stay as is? Like, some of them they're trying to sell them for like outrageous prices. I'm like looking at one, like right now, like 1885 Sullivan Avenue. Its list price is $900,000. Like, there's a commercial property across the street from me, right off of Broad and well, where Josie's is. Josie's Pizza, right across the street. The old cash checking place or tail load place. They are listing that property for I think it was almost $2 million. It was 1 point. Like, so like they're trying to like sell these like vacant properties they're not doing anything with. Like these are not prices that are actually going to sell so that people can actually do anything with them. So like one, like how do you get the prices down to a point where like somebody will buy them? And then the second part is like, you know, where do you get the gap funding? Because, you know, anything that we do, like, you know, we may be able to put, you know, 20, 30, $40,000 into it, like, you know, a couple of people, but it's going to take $200,000 to, you know, flip any of these around. So like, I'm just like trying to figure out like one, like, you know, these prices as is, nobody can do anything with them. And then like, you know, even if you can get them, where do you get the money to actually do anything with it? Like that's.
Patrick, let me ask you a question. For somebody who's asking that kind of money for that property, what do you imagine somebody could do with that property that would warrant a $2 million price tag?
I mean, if it was completely zoned differently, maybe you could do something. But like the reality is like, you know, some of them are like open lots, and like, yeah, if you demolish it, build out to all the edges, and you make a 5 or 6 story building, sure, then it's worth it. But like that's illegal here. So you can't even do that. So like I don't know, you know, what their thoughts are, but like they have like if you look at like the square footage. You know, print of it, okay, yeah, maybe you could do something if it was downtown, but it's not.
Most of those are tax shelters. I mean, it's, we discovered.
Back in the day.
What?
I always had real estate write-offs throughout the 90s. I very rarely paid any tax, but now I don't own anything. But that's what you do with them, or you pass drugs through them, I guess.
Back when we were, I didn't mean to laugh, but back when we were arguing about the West Side Medical Center at the fire station and trying to preserve the firehouse, Alina Butler and I tried to get a hold of the property owners of the vacant, you know, some or only partially occupied retail / residential spaces in the NCR district. And they wanted stupid amounts of money for them. And it's because it is more profitable for them to own these properties and leave them vacant than it is to keep trying to put tenants in there then being expected to maintain buildings, being expected to keep things up to code. So they just keep them around as they're technically owned by their shell companies, and that is their tax write-off. Right. So that's why they're $2 million for a big honkin' property.
Well, here's an idea.
We've got a lot of those.
Write-offs. I mean, with that amount, Cliff, can you imagine the write-offs every year for depreciation? Then you just swap buildings with someone else and you start it all over again. I mean, but anyway, everyone.
Yeah, you know, I was told years ago that if you see something that looks like it's a code violation, it almost certainly is a code violation. And so if there are buildings on Broad Street that look like code violations, one strategy might be to work with code enforcement, say on the building that is the property where there's a $2 million asking price, and, you know, make property owner. Because I'll bet that you could coordinate with, you could probably set up priorities on Broad Street or Sullivan Avenue with code enforcement on properties you think need to be addressed.
Yeah, we need to.
And my guess is that owner that is asking $2 million wants to spend as little time and energy on that property as possible.
Right. Make it more expensive to own it than just to dump the thing onto someone for half the amount. Anyway, everyone, we're at the end of our evening. We went run over about 4 minutes. I do apologize. Cleve, thank you so much. Like I always tell people, if I ever need, like when I needed advice on banners years ago, who did I call? I called you, and then you gave me to that woman who handled your downtown Columbus banners to help me with my problem. We had that banner project replaced at their expense 3 times, and we haven't done a banner project since, but we're getting ready to, because it's time. We're depressed. We need something bright on Broad. But anyway, I appreciate you for coming, Cleve. We'll let you get back to your game with the
Okay.
Cleveland Browns. And as far as everyone else, thank you so much for coming and being here for the duration. I love these kind of meetings because I think they really add to our inspiration and give us something to chew on. So now we can go forward and we're ready. You've recharged us, Cleve. Thank you
Good,
so
good.
much.
Well, thank you. I love Hilltop, so I'm happy to do it.
Thank you, everyone. And
Thank you so much.
Good night.
goodbye
Good
now.
night.
Thanks, Cleve.